on successful implementation of vegetative practices, lessons learned from the fields. With that, Valerie, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, here we go. How does that look?
Good.
All right. For my talk, I'm going to be talking about vegetative practice implementation and some of the challenges and common causes of failure that you may see. And then I'm going to go into some case studies where I thought it would be valuable to share some of my experiences. We've had a lot of really great, successful field plantings, but we've also had quite a few where we've run into some challenges and issues. And those I've learned a lot from, and I wanted to share some of those lessons with you guys so you don't make the same mistakes I have. And then talk about some keys to successfully implementing vegetative practices. So seed bed prep, timing, seed quality and soil condition, and planting. So Margaret kind of went through these already, so I'll just go through them pretty quick, but just listing some of the questions that need to be asked either of yourself if you're putting in a vegetative practice or cover crop or conservation cover, or if you're working with a grower who's putting one in, where it's going to go, when is it going to go in, how are they going to plant it, and then is it going to be a single species or a mix? How are they going to manage it around their operation and their typical, their cash crop? Because it does take more work and time, and it is a bit tricky. What type of system is it going in? Is it going in an annual crop, a perennial crop, a rangeland, a pasture? And then how are we going to water it? Is it going to be just rain fed? Is there an irrigation source? How much? Where's the irrigation source? And when is the water coming? So is it flood irrigated? Solid set sprinklers? How are we going to get water to it, especially in California? And then considering things like costs of the seed, there can be a huge range in cost from a single species like Triticale, and then go all the way up to some fancy wildflower mix that is pretty expensive. And then the costs that go into management, so time, labor, equipment it takes to manage that planting. And then finally, calibrating producer expectations or your expectations. So what do you think it's going to look like? How big is it going to get? How much extra work is it going to take to manage this? How much extra work do you want to put into it? And expecting that if it's your first year, it's probably not going to look awesome. It takes a couple years to get the hang of it, but it's worth it to keep at it. But I'll turn on my video so you can see me. Okay. And then just some of the most common causes of failure with plantings will have to do with seed bed prep and planting. And so improper seed bed prep can be a huge problem. If you plant it at the right time or wrong time of year, it can be an issue if it's planted too deep or too shallow. And then if it's poor quality seed or there's not enough soil moisture, you won't get those seedlings germinating. And then some causes of failure after the seedlings have emerged include not having enough irrigation or rainwater. So getting a little bit of sprinkle in the early fall and then having a dry spell can really hurt those little seedlings. And then things like weed competition can smother out some of the seedlings, or they can get damaged from grazing or traffic. So now I'll go into the fun part, which is taking a look at some of these case studies and plantings that I've done across the state and that I've learned from valuable lessons from. So most of these are cover crop plantings, because that's just what we've done more of and worked with field staff and collaborators with. So this first one was looking at 3 different mixes and comparing them to Triticale in a walnut orchard. And some of the challenges we ran into were challenges with the equipment, and then the location of the plantings. So identifying clearly where the location was. So some of the mixes, like annual plowdown mix and a brassica mix, there's a huge difference in seed size between those 2 mixes. And I'll show you in the next slide what those look like. So calibrating the seeder is is an important step for if you're going to plant things like this. And then the seed was uncovered after drilling. There was nothing behind the drill to push some soil over the top, so the seed was left exposed. And you can see in the lower right picture, there's a fava bean that germinated actually above the soil surface. So it's not in the soil, it's just going to dry up and die. So you really want to get really good seed to soil contact. And then the planting location was moved after the first year because we didn't mark the site clearly enough, and one of the standard mixes that the grower was using was planted over some of our experimental mixes. So make sure you mark and flag the locations clearly if you're doing like a side-by-side, really important, especially if you're going to do it for multiple years. And then it's always a good idea to go out there and help supervise the calibration of the drill and the planting, especially if you're doing multiple mixes. So on the right, you can see the huge difference in seed size between a annual plowdown mix, where you have to open up the feeding tubes all the way to get those fava bean seeds to get out. And then the brassica mix, which is on the opposite side of the scale, and you have to close it as tight as you can so that seed doesn't just dump out on the ground. And then on the lower left, you can see a gentleman dragging a bar behind his drill, and that's to help cover the seed and kick some soil back over and protect the seed so there's some good seed to soil contact. And then another site was down further south on an organic citrus orchard, looking at Triticale and an annual clover mix. And challenges with this site were equipment, water, and weeds. So there's really high weed pressure throughout the orchard. The only irrigation available was as drip lines around the trees, so we weren't going to get any water to this cover crop in the middles. And the grain drill was challenging because the seed cups, or the feeder tubes, didn't tighten down for the clovers. It fed the Triticale just fine, but that clover just dumped out too quickly, and we were trying to cover about 3 middles, and I think we only made it 1. And then the clovers also were not very weed competitive. You can see in the bottom there, in May, there's a little strip of clovers, and then all the rest is annual grasses. So they don't do so well. And the Triticale did okay, but the grower really wanted some additional nitrogen. So some suggestions to improve this planting would have been to add a seed carrier to the clover to help distribute it more evenly and kind of help it feed through the planter a little bit better. And then some irrigation definitely would have helped with germination, and it would have also been beneficial for some more vegetative growth if you don't have enough rainfall. Weed management for an organic system like this would be mowing. Clovers respond really well to mowing. You can mow them 2 to 3 inches and they'll bounce back. So you can knock down those weeds and give the clovers a little chance. And then another option would be to maybe choose some more weed competitive species. So on the lower right, you can see an annual plowdown mix in a citrus orchard, and it definitely has more weed suppression and is going to produce a lot more nitrogen, but that's a frost concern for citrus, so it got way too big. And so if you're looking at other species, just keep things like that in mind. Another site in the valley in a walnut orchard, there was a mustard mix and clover mix that were actually planted together. They're supposed to be side-by-side comparison, but mixing them was actually an interesting experiment, and it turned out really well. And the challenges with this one were equipment, the soils, and the grower expectations. So they were very sandy soils, very dry, kind of like a sandbox sandy. And then we used a grain drill to plant it. Again, the grain drill had a hard time getting metering the seed out properly. It just kind of dumped out quickly. So cranking it down was an issue. There was only about half the block was planted, and it was very dense because the seeding rate was so high because we couldn't slowly and properly meter that seed out. And then the grower, the big disappointment with this was the grower was embarrassed with the result. He was really unhappy with it. I thought it actually looked great. I was really happy, and you know, for a first-year cover crop on a sandy soil, that looks pretty good. But he was expecting a nice, big, lush green cover crop, and didn't even want to come out and talk to us and meet with us. And I highly doubt he did it again the next year, which is unfortunate. I should have talked with him more about what it would look like. So some other suggestions would be adding a seed carrier like rice hulls to the mix to kind of help it feed through the drill better, or maybe even don't use a drill, use a broadcast seeder, you know, mounted on the back of a tractor, or using a belly grinder. And then you can go through, on the right, we actually went through and used a turf press that we pulled behind a quad so we could push that seed into the ground and get some good seed to soil contact. And then I know it's not always possible, but if you can, it's really great to get out there and supervise the calibration and the planting, because if they're adopting cover crops, maybe some of them haven't done it before or haven't done the certain seed, and it can vary widely, and it can be challenging. So kind of helping them through that on how to crank it down, how to calibrate it, and kind of what to expect is really helpful, especially the first year, getting them started. Another site in an almond orchard down in the valley, looking at Triticale and annual clover mix. And this one was a challenge because of water and soil moisture, and then the residue of the Triticale. So it was very dry, sandy soil with and a very dry year as well. So there's little to no germination in the middles. The only irrigation that was available was the micro sprinklers, which hit a little section of the middles, and so you got these kind of half moon shapes down the aisles. The Triticale did okay, but it did leave quite a bit of residue, which for some growers could be seen as an issue when they're sweeping up the almonds. So some suggestions would be maybe bring in another water source just to help with that germination and establishment. So something like a water truck. Or maybe looking at more drought tolerant cover crop species that would decompose quickly. Almonds are a little tricky because you want something that fixes nitrogen, is low growing because of frost concerns, or at least can handle mowing, and then will decompose quickly. So there's nothing left over when you go out to sweep your nuts, but it's tricky. So still working on the perfect mix for almond orchards. So below you can see a picture of the Triticale in March, and kind of there's not much cover in the middle. As you see the little bumps along the edges as you go down, and those are where the micro sprinklers are hitting the middles, and so it's doing a little bit better and growing a little bigger, where it's getting some moisture. And then here's another section of the orchard where the Triticale did pretty well, and just the level of residue that you can get. So if it's hot and dry and doesn't rain anymore, this is going to take a long time to decompose and can be a problem. And then finally, this is a little bit different type of planting. It was cover crop / range seeding. So the first year we went in and we were using an annual cover or multiple annual cover crops, taking a look at them as smother crops. So we were trying to combat the annual grasses on this rangeland with a smother crop before coming in the second year and planting some more desirable forage as perennial grasses. So this one had its challenges. When we started off, 2 of the feeder tubes were clogged. So we made a pass and noticed that 2 of the feeder tubes, there's no seed coming out, and went in and looked, and there's actually a mouse nest under the seed box. So be sure you go in and clean your drill before you start planting, because if there's seed left in there, all kinds of critters love to crawl in there, and they might just stay. And so when you take it out for the first time, be sure to do really thorough cleaning and make sure your seed is actually coming out of the drill. The seedlings had a really hard time competing with the annual grasses. And then cattle were let in earlier than expected, and decided to pull out the flags and markers that were out there. And they really enjoyed the seeded area the most and grazed it down really hard. And they thought it was really tasty, which I guess is good, but no, there was no sign of the planted species after they were in there. So that was a disappointment. So for if I were to do this again, I would definitely go in and do some weed management, to maybe treat it with a broad spectrum herbicide prior to planting, or use maybe a selective herbicide for annual grasses. Improve the planting protocols and specifications. Be really specific with what we expect the management to be with the grower. What we, keep the cattle out, or put a fence around it, or mow at a certain time, or call us basically before you do anything. And then be there to supervise the calibration and planting, so you can help and make sure seeds coming out of all those tubes at the right rate, at the right depth, and at the right spacing, so you can have a really successful planting. And then go out and inspect the planting as soon as possible after emergence. We have a few seedling IDs online that are available where you can identify the species when they're small. We're looking at putting out some more as well. But it's nice to go out there and be able to see what's actually germinating before they're out competed, or see things what might do well. Or the other thing would be to protect the seedlings from grazing, so until they're fully established. And that would be for a minimum, I would say, 1 growing season. If you can do it for 2 or 3, that's better, because they can get a really good root system established, and they can't just be yanked from the ground. So and then just to go through some keys to successful implementing vegetation practices successfully the number 1 thing would be seed bed prep, as good seed to soil contact is essential. And if we can get the seed bed prep right, it will definitely improve and dramatically improve our chances of success with that field planting. It's like one of the few things you can control, so it's worth it. And so that seed bed should be firm and clod free with minimal residue. If there's a high weed pressure, maybe do some weed control, either with a chemical treatment or maybe mechanical. Pre-irrigation, if it's an option, really helps with germination and vegetation growth, but we know this isn't always an option. And then timing of the planting is really important. So Margaret went over species selection. So you're going to choose a cool season species. Those typically are planted in the fall, October, November, or in the early spring where there's still some soil moisture or chance of rain. And these species are really cold tolerant, and they can handle the cold temperatures over the winter, which is unlike the warm season species that need to be planted after frost, after the risk of frost has passed. So May through September, because freezing temperatures will kill these species, and they can tolerate the really hot, high temperatures of the Central Valley summers, but they do require irrigation. And then just some other things to check for would be the quality of the seed. Check your germination. Make sure it's tested in the last year. If it's not, don't use old seed lots. Don't use seed that's been in the barn for 5 years. You want to start off with your seedling or your planting on the right foot. You don't want to use old seed because it decreases pretty quickly. The germination rate decreases pretty quickly. And then also check to make sure if it has hard seed, because that seed won't always readily germinate. So it could come up the next year or later, but you want to make sure you know what to expect. And then check for soil moisture when you're planting. If you need to, those seedlings could really get some help with with some irrigation or some soil moisture. They can get better root systems going and really get established than if they're it's years like this are challenging, where you plant into some moisture and then it's dry for months, and then the little seedlings just dry up and wither away because there's no moisture, or no water. So, and then check for crusted soil surfaces. These are really a big pain. We've had this issue at the PMC actually, and I was horrified. One of our plantings, this is a picture of pigeon pea and one of our plantings at the PMC, and you can see some chunks on the top of the surface. So that the seedlings germinate, and then they hit that hard surface, and then what they say is it breaks their neck, so they can't extend out of the soil. So your seedlings die because they can't actually emerge out of the soil. So make sure that doesn't happen. And then for planting, if you're drilling, be sure to check your coulter positioning, which is your planting depth, and then the seed type you're going to use. So if you're using big species and small species, is it better to just do 2 passes instead of mixing them? Because you don't want to plant the small seeds too deep because they won't germinate. If there's no press wheels, drag something behind the drill just to cover the seed and make sure you get that good seed to soil contact. And be sure to check the drill several times at the beginning of the planting to make sure the seeding depth is correct, it's metering properly, and it's the spacing is right. It's not just dumping out of the drill. And also make sure the drive wheel is touching the soil surface to make sure it meters out, because if that wheel's not touching, the seed's not coming out. And then for broadcasting, the seeding rate should be 1.5 to 2 times higher than the recommended drill rate. For broadcasters, it's probably a lot easier to apply small seeds and big seeds separately versus mixing them. I've tried to plant fava beans and wildflower seed together, and it is very hard to get an even distribution. I recommend separating them out and doing just 2 passes. And then for after you broadcast, come through with a cultipacker or a chain or something to kind of push the seed in a little bit. You don't want to cover them more than a half an inch though. And then for larger seeds, you can cover them a bit more with a layer of topsoil with something like a ring roller or spring tooth harrow. So that's it. That's questions.
Thank you, Valerie. We do have a couple questions here in the chat, so I'll start reading those. Also, if anybody has a question and would like to ask it verbally, please raise your hand. Somebody asked, have you ever had any problems with allelopathic trees, for example, walnuts, eucalyptus, and germination of cover crop seeds?
No. So what? I haven't tried eucalyptus. Well, eucalyptus we have here at the PMC. We don't usually plant too close to them. What's more of an issue for is actually the leaf litter. So because there's so much leaf litter, it's a better idea to plant before the leaves fall. And it's not as much the allelopathy, it's just the amount of leaf litter that the plants have to, or seedlings have to grow through to get to sunlight. So usually for things like walnuts, the bigger seeded species do better, or brassicas. Clovers and some of the annual grasses don't do as well because they just get buried.
Okay. Have you done any winter cover crops on irrigated pastures that will be hayed prior to grazing them?
I have not.
All right. And there are a couple of comments. And I have another question here for you. How long did it take you to feel comfortable planting cover crops?
It's always interesting. It's always something different because each site is different. I'm a lot more comfortable here at the PMC because I'm at the same site planting over and over. But if I ever go out and do a field planting, it's important to ask all those questions because you're planting in a different soil, a different system every time, a different planter. So I'm feeling more confident because I have kind of my checklist and questions that I go through, and that really helps the success rate of planting cover crops. So it takes a little bit to get the hang of it, but it's definitely worth it.
Yes.
And we're here to help. The PMC is here to help.
That will be a great resource. I know as a planner, I'm getting an increased amount of producers that are definitely looking to implement these cover crop practices. So it's great. Exciting times. All right, another question for you. Do you have any experience with terminating cover crops with grazing animals?
No, I don't.
Or have you heard of anything about that? Do you have anything to offer about that?
It seems like a great option. Margaret, do you have any experience?
Well, no. I mean, I think the potential is vast here. I know in some parts of the country, they're finding huge increases in soil health when they use grazing animals because of, it terminates it and then you have the manure and so on. And so it really speeds up nutrient cycling and helps the soils grow. In California, it's trickier. We don't have the fencing, but I think there are some, like particularly sheep, like Amelie Godin at the University, of Davis, and UC Davis is doing work with grazing with sheep. and she's having good results. There was a presentation, I think it last fall or spring, but it's going to be hard, I think, to implement for California. Probably not for wine grapes, but even then you're going to need fencing, you need the contract people to do it. I would love to see more of it here, but at the moment the almond board doesn't want it in California, not while we're picking up almonds off the ground. So anyway, that's kind of a brief answer.
It definitely has a lot of potential, and depending on the system that it's in, maybe we can talk about it more if it's something you want to try, or maybe it'd be something really neat to look at.
Absolutely. Someone put in the comment that there is an almond grower in Madera who is grazing sheep in his orchard. So it sounds like producers are independently trying this. So I hope that we learn much more about it here in the coming days. And yeah, there are restrictions, obviously, with orchards that we harvest up, that we shake and then harvest off the ground, but it'll be interesting to see where that leads us.
Very cool.
Right. Yeah. So if we're going to give it a couple more moments here. Somebody mentioned sheep have been used in Napa to graze vineyards. Very good. All right, a couple more moments here. If anybody has any last questions, please don't be shy. Raise your hand or unmute yourself or type it into chat. While we have the great experience of Valerie and Margaret on board with us right now.
I see another question in the chat. What cover crop would you recommend for farmers with nematode issues?
Mustards.
Absolutely. And maybe in the summer, sun hemp is recommended for root knot nematode. But yeah, mustards, very good.
One. Yeah.
And actually, with plant parasitic nematodes, if you increase soil health, you will be increasing all the microorganisms in the soil, and then that will lead to increase in the predatory nematodes, which will tend to eat the plant parasitic nematodes. So over time, as your soil gets healthier, you should have less nematode issues. Anyway, quite apart from the mustards.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, at this time, if nobody has any other questions, I just want to remind everybody that these recordings will be available on our chapter YouTube page, and Sonia has included the link to that in the chat here. So those should be available Tuesday. We want to thank everybody for joining us today, and our contact information for the Lockeford PMC Center is here on the screen. And as well as our chapter, California, Nevada, SWCS. If you have any questions, would like to discuss membership, please reach out to us. And with that, I would just like to thank everybody for being here today, and we hope to see you next time.